All right, great. So, yeah, once again, thanks for having me here today, Emily. I'm happy to talk about the work that we've been conducting in the Pocantico Watershed. As Emily said, my name is Mike Rubbo. I'm faculty at Pace University down in Pleasantville, New York, and I'm going to be talking about a student-led characterization of the Pocantico River Watershed. So, even though I'm talking about this work, it really represents the efforts of a number of people, other faculty at Pace, some staff at Pace, and lots of students. Most of what I'm going to be presenting here today was conducted by students under our guidance. Is it working? Okay. So the goals of this presentation are first and foremost to summarize a process that we use to conduct a characterization of the watershed. It might be a little different from other types of characterizations, especially since we had students so actively involved. So we're going to kind of highlight the process that we used. I'm going to talk about some of the findings of the characterization. I'm not going to get into too much depth because it'd just be too much for today's presentation. But some of the more interesting findings I wanted to talk about and share with you all. I'm going to present a story map that we use to present some of our watershed info. So this was a very public-facing tool that we decided to try to use to kind of get the word out about the work that we were conducting in the watershed. As I go through the process, I'm going to kind of weave in an analysis of our approach and focusing mainly on some of the challenges or some of the issues that we ran up against. Um, and finally, I'm going to talk about how students can be used to support conservation efforts, especially at the local level. It's something I've been doing a lot of since I've been at Pace, and I think it provides a great opportunity to kind of as a win-win situation to leverage the resources of a university and the opportunities that communities can provide. So that's what I'm hoping to cover today. So before I get started, I want to give some just general background because I know we have people kind of attending from all over the area. So the Pocantico Watershed, it's this little red blob down here. That's the boundary of the watershed. We are in the lower Hudson River, the lower Hudson region of New York, in Westchester County. So you can see, I don't know if you guys can see this line right here is the Tappan Zee. The watershed is right here. It's about just under 10,000 acres in size. Um, it occurs in a variety of municipalities, which makes things kind of challenging. So it's in the towns of Ossining, Mount Pleasant, and Newcastle, and also the villages of Briarcliff Manor, Sleepy Hollow, and a little bit in Pleasantville. So you do have that kind of dynamic where you're getting multiple municipalities involved, which maybe isn't that uncommon, but it definitely presents a challenge. The river itself, which is this dark blue line right here in the center, the Pocantico River, it starts in the northern end of the watershed. It starts at Echo Lake, which is a small man-made lake. It's about 10 acres or so in size. The river flows to the south, where it empties into the Hudson at the village of Sleepy Hollow. So it's about 9.5 miles in length. In terms of unique natural resources in the watershed, there's a number of major, fairly large open spaces. In the southern end, down in this area right here, is Rockefeller State Park and Preserve, which is over 1,700 acres. Up in the kind of northeastern edge, there's a town park. The town of Mount Pleasant has the Hard Scrabble Wilderness Area, which is about 250 acres. And in the center, we have Pocantico Lake Park. There's a county park here as well as a town park that abut one another right next to Pocantico Lake, which is about another 165 acres. There's also Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture. You may have heard of it. They have the famous Blue Hills restaurant there as well. That's down right off that borders Rockefeller Preserve down here as well. But they have their property is open to the public as well. And then there's a couple of large private properties in the watershed as well that are kept as open space. There's the Edith Macy Conference Center, which is up here in this region. That used to be owned by the Girl Scouts, but I think it just recently transitioned. And now I think it's a private conference center now. And just immediately to the north of that, up here is the Campfire Club. which is a conservation-based organization. They have about 200 acres as well. So a good chunk of the watershed that we're dealing with is developed, but there are significant tracts of open space available. So very suburbanized. So to kind of give you some context for what's been going on in the watershed, I wanted to give you a brief history or brief summary of the history of work in the watershed. Historically, there have been two main watershed groups. There's a group called the Pocantico River Watershed Conservancy. It's a 501(c)(3), and it was founded in 2012. It was founded by Professor Nick Robinson, who is at Pace Law School. And then there's also the Pocantico River Watershed Alliance, which is a more community-based group whose focus has been primarily on education. So we have these two groups, and you may think, well, that's great. You have two groups in the watershed. Unfortunately, both groups are currently inactive. So there's not much going on with either group. And that's something I'm going to talk a little bit more about as we move forwards in the presentation, but it definitely presents a challenge. But despite this, there have been a number of other groups that have been engaged in conservation in the watershed. Riverkeeper has done some work in the river, Rockefeller Preserve, DEC has done work down here, Westchester County has been involved, Hudsonia, Stone Barns. There's a local community group called Save Pocantico Lake that's very active. Local CACs have done some work as well, and obviously PACE, which is where I'm involved. So some of the work that PACE has done, so to give you kind of just some backgrounds, I've been at PACE now since 2017. So we've done a variety of kind of natural resource studies in the watershed, using that as kind of a base of operations, so to speak. In 2016, the Hudson River ESRI program provided a grant to do habitat mapping in the watershed. So this was using the traditional Hudsonia approach of aerial photograph interpretation, supplemented with some field validation. So we did work with students on this as well, where students went out and conducted a lot of the field work. But we mapped habitats in the watershed, and you can see in the map here on the left, all of these kind of the areas that lack color, the white areas are considered developed. So we have large swaths of developed land in the watershed. Makes sense, right? Because we're in a suburban area. And then we have these kind of two kind of clusters of habitat. Once again, one in the south, which is associated Rockefeller Preserve, and one in the north, which is associated with that Hardscrabble Preserve and those two private properties that I mentioned. We use these data to identify what we call priority areas, priority conservation areas. And once again, they just align with the areas that have intact habitat. We overlaid the Pocantico River and a buffer on that as another priority area for conservation in the watershed. So once again, this was all done before any of the watershed characterization process started. We've also done some wildlife studies in the watershed to get a handle on, once again, the natural resources that are there, some of the biodiversity attributes. We've done camera trapping using the motion activated camera traps to survey large mammals. We found pretty much the usual suspects, lots of coyote, some fox, a few bobcat, which were mainly in this northern section up here. But once again, most of the diversity was tied to these two blocks of large contiguous habitat. Not a surprise there as well. But once again, just more information that we're collecting on the natural resources of the watershed. So we've been working on gathering this information. As I said, other groups have been gathering information as well. And we started to think about, well, we have all this information. It's all kind of disparate. It's all spread out. But we need to bring this all together so we get an understanding of the current conditions of the watershed. So PACE applied for and received a grant from the ESRI program to conduct a watershed characterization to do this. And the major goals of this characterization were, once again, bringing all of these data and collating all of these data together. So it's all in one place. We wanted to conduct some ecological assessments of the river to get a better understanding of the condition of the river from source to sink. We wanted to talk to stakeholders as part of this process to get their thoughts on the watershed. And in addition to talking to major stakeholders, we also interviewed the general public. And we also added a fish survey as part of this. So the DEC has been doing fish surveys in the Pocantico for a while. The DEC actually stocks brown trout in Rockefeller Preserve. So there were gaps, mostly in the lower river. There's a lot of information on the fish community, and we wanted to focus on the upper reaches of the river to kind of get a better understanding of the fish community along the entire length of the river. We also wanted to do water quality assessments of the river to get a better understanding of the health of the water. I want to be crystal clear that these were not part of the grant to do any sort of water testing through DEC funded grants. All of the tests have to be conducted in a ELAP certified lab, and the lab at Pace is not ELAP certified. So these water quality assessments were independent of the grant. So the goal was to take all of these data together, summarize the current state of the watershed, and use that to create goals and objectives for the conservation of the watershed. We were hoping that this would give future direction to watershed groups, give them a purpose, things to work on. So I'm going to just go through, once again, I'm not going to go through the entire characterization. That would take far too long, but I'm going to go through a few aspects, as I said, some highlights, if you will, of the characterization process. So our first step was collecting existing information. We did the basic work, like we looked at the municipalities and collected demographic data using the US Census data. We also looked into the current environmental regulations of the communities in the watershed. So we just went to general code and just typed in some of the kind of standard environmental ordinances that you see in the area, wetlands, for instance, tree ordinances, those kinds of things. And all we did here was just to summarize what existing ordinances these communities had in the books. We didn't dive into these ordinances to look at details, for instance, like what size wetlands are protecting or buffers or things like that, just whether or not they even had a policy that was on the books. So just we created this matrix here. You can see green, the policy is present, red, it is not. So you can see for the most part, most of these communities have pretty robust set of environmental policies in their code, in their town code. Surprisingly, none of the municipalities had an open space plan, and a couple have either recently completed or are working on a natural resource inventory. So this gives us just a basic understanding of some of the policies that are in place currently. We also did the standard GIS mapping, which is a big part of these characterizations, pulling together all the existing GIS data and creating a variety of maps. I'm not going to go through all these. You can see there's a ton of them. It's kind of like a laundry list of available GIS data. Some of the more interesting data for our purposes, you can see this map here on the right is showing where there are sewer mains or sewer lines in the watershed and where there are septic pump outs. So Westchester County fairly recently started collecting data whenever someone has their septic tank pumped out. So it helps give us an understanding of the locations of which parcels are on septic versus sewer. And that's going to play a role in a little bit that I'm going to talk about. So that's GIS data. So we also collected, as I said, collated any sort of prior studies or information that are out there. Riverkeeper, as I said, have been collecting water quality data on the Pocantico for quite a while. So we collated their data. We got requested data from DEC Fisheries on the fish surveys that they had done in the Pocantico. And as I said, it was fairly extensive. So those were very helpful data. iNaturalist, which is a great source of general biodiversity information. So this panel on the right is an iNaturalist summary of all of the observations in the Pocantico watershed. So you could create a project for your watershed by just importing the boundary of the watershed into iNaturalist, and it'll pull all of those observations that occur within that boundary and let you know what has been documented in that area. So once again, this is just a summary, but there's over 2,000 species that have been documented in the Pocantico watershed. IMAP invasives is another tool that you can use to understand distributions of invasive species within your watershed. So once again, like I said, pulling all this information together, just getting a baseline, taking everything that's out there and summarizing the current state of knowledge of the watershed. So that was the first phase, was just getting all of that information together. Our next phase was actually collecting some of our own data, so filling in the gaps in that information. Um, so there were a couple major phases of this. We did interviews, as I said, of major stakeholders to learn of their perceptions and concerns related to the watershed. We conducted ecological assessments of the main river. We did our water quality testing and our fish surveys. And here's a couple of pictures of students out in the field. I'm really bad at taking pictures. I never remember to take them, and I always take them showing the backs of the students, which is a major no-no. So I've been working on trying to get the students to face the camera and actually smile and look happy for some of these pictures. Unfortunately, I did not have any for this presentation today, but it's something I'm working towards. All right, so our first step in data collection, and this was led by a student. So we identified major stakeholders in the watershed, and the way we went about this was just talking to people, talking to community leaders, talking to community groups, just asking people, who do you think are major players in the watershed? We were really focusing on individuals or entities that played a major role in, or we felt influenced, had a major influence, or their activities had a major influence on the watershed. So either they were large landowners or they were municipalities that whose policies affected what was happening in the watershed itself. So we ended up creating a group. We had various groups. So we had government organizations. We had 8 of those, 9 private nonprofit organizations, 9 private for-profit organizations, or 10 private for-profit organizations, and 2 community groups. I know this is really small. I apologize. The table on the right. My Zoom window's in the way. Let me move it. But you can see we have government agencies like the towns and villages, the county, state parks. We had our private groups like the Campfire Club and the Macy Center, our nonprofit organizations, the Conservancies, Riverkeeper, Westchester Land Trust plays a role. Other private groups, we had golf courses, we have a fairly large cemetery, Con Ed, homeowners associations, things like that. So we reached out to all of these homeowners to try to schedule interviews with them. I mean, not homeowners, stakeholders, to schedule interviews with them to kind of, once again, to hear their thoughts on the watershed. You can see on the column on the right, we have yes or no, whether they were interviewed. A couple NAs, these groups were added after the interviews were conducted. So what did we find? We conducted, so there were, let's see, 29 stakeholders that we identified, and I'm sure there are more, but this is, once again, this is the initial characterization. 29 stakeholders, we conducted 12 interviews representing 10 different stakeholder groups. So not too bad. If you've done these kinds of surveys before, that's not terrible. The issue that we had was no private for-profits agreed to interviews, which was fairly disappointing. We could not get any of these stakeholders to even talk to us. I'm not maybe not 100% surprised about that, but we were a little disappointed. So here are some basic data. Once again, I'm not going to go through all of the data that we collected, just a few, go through a few of the findings. So we asked what the stakeholders' opinion was of the condition of the watershed, and most said good or fair. We asked the values, that stakeholders' values of the watershed. And you can see the overwhelming majority said recreation, which I thought was a little surprising. We thought flooding maybe would have, or stormwater mitigation would have been a bigger response, but recreation was a primary response. When discussing threats, most said non-point source pollution or development. Once again, not entirely surprising considering we're in such a suburbanized landscape. That was the red and the yellow here. And then finally, we asked, what do you see as barriers to protecting or conserving the watershed? And this one was a little more evenly distributed across the different categories. So purple, where it was ownership of the land, red is issues with permitting processes, green was lack of awareness or understanding, and then the light blue is property rights, and the darker blue is lack of communication and coordination. So that was interesting that the largest response was lack of communication and coordination. So That's something that we're looking into a little bit more. We're trying to understand, well, how can we kind of increase communication within the watershed? We have all these stakeholder groups. They don't seem to be maybe talking to one another. How can we facilitate those conversations? We don't have an answer for that, but it's something that I'm sure it's not an uncommon problem, but it's something that we're kind of struggling with, to be honest. So in addition to interviewing stakeholders, we also interviewed the general public. And once again, these interviews were all conducted by students. So they posted up at different parks and preserves throughout the watershed, and they just walked up to people and asked them if they'd be willing to participate in a brief interview. So once again, these were mainly at trailheads. We tried to locate these interviews within visual distance of the river, which wasn't that difficult because most of the parks in the area are right along the river. Students conducted 65 interviews, which was a pretty good amount over the course of the summer. And once again, these are with just the general public, so whoever happened to be walking by that agreed to participate. So do you know the name of the river? Simple, just to start off with, it was about 50-50. Half said no, half said yes. Do you think the water is clean or dirty? 81% thought the water was clean, which was, I thought, fairly surprising given the location in, southern Westchester County, but most people thought the water was clean. However, even though they thought it was clean, it was a 50-50 split as to whether or not people said they would feel safe swimming or wading there. We also asked if they would feel comfortable eating fish from the river, and it was the same thing, it was about a 50-50 split. So even though people thought the water was clean, there was some hesitancy there. We asked also what types of environmental problems do they think might exist here in the river, and most said pollution. So pollution is a fairly general category, so we wanted to get at to, well, what specifically about pollution? So we followed that up, and you can see most people who answered pollution said that pollution was coming from roads or runoff or litter or dumping. Not a lot said nutrients, not a lot said sewage. Some just weren't sure. So these are, the roads and runoff, they're very visible because as I said, most of the locations where these interviews were conducted, people could see the river, but they were also probably not too far from roads. And litter and dumping obviously is a very visual form of pollution. So what was interesting is that the user's perception of the water quality, which most 81% thought the water was clean, didn't match the data that we collected. And I'll talk more about this in a minute. Our data, specifically our data on bacteria levels and phosphate, show poor water quality. So people thought it was clean, but the water actually wasn't clean. We had this little bit of a disconnect here. We think what's driving this is you can't see bacteria in the water, or nor can you see phosphate, unless you have an active algal bloom, which we didn't at the time. So these are interesting because once again, they're not visual cues in terms of pollution. So it suggests to us that there needs to be more education about issues like water quality, especially in this watershed. It's not always something you can see. All right, so moving on from the interviews, then we started to conduct some field work. We conducted some stream assessments. We used a protocol from the Natural Resource Conservation Service called the Stream Visual Assessment Protocol, SVAP. These are rapid assessments, so they can be done fairly quickly. They're all visual, so they don't require any sort of data collection. These were led by students. We conducted these assessments every 200 meters along the length of the river. We had 70 total sites. So if you look at the map on the right, each dot represents a location where we conducted an assessment. So at each one of those dots, according to the protocol, you evaluate the river for all of these criteria. And I'm not going to go through each one, but you can see them all here. And once again, it's a visual survey. So the protocol gives you scoring criteria for each one of these categories. So you score them on a scale. Most of them are from 0 to 10. And the way that the method's broken down is it gives you, for 1 to 3, these criteria are present, and so forth and so on. So it gives you specific things to look for when you're scoring these categories. Now, keep in mind, we're not measuring things, so it is fairly subjective since it's a visual process. I went out with the students for a few weeks prior to starting this, and we kind of did practice runs and we compared our scores. And if we were widely different in one of our scores, we would talk about why. And eventually we got it to the point where we were all pretty much on the same page in terms of the scoring. So we tried to minimize kind of that individual variability as much as possible. And it was the same two students that did all of these, once again, to kind of to minimize that variation. So you get a score for each of these variables, you average them all together, it gives you an overall score for that individual site. And it could score as excellent, good, fair, or poor. So the dots are color coded. Green is good, orange is fair, and red is poor. We had no sites that scored excellent overall. So if you look at all the colors, you're mostly seeing what? You're mostly seeing greens and orange colors. So good slash poor. I mean, good slash fair. There's a few reds up top and down at the bottom. Up top by Echo Lake, there is red here because the channel was modified due to construction activities. And down here is where it empties into Sleepy Hollow. There's also quite a bit of modification to the river itself. But otherwise, for the most part, it wasn't too bad. And when looking a little more closely at this, these are the various categories and how they were scored. This is averaging all of the 70 sites across the river. Once again, so dark green is excellent, light green is good, orange is fair, and red is poor. The three categories that scored poor were in-stream fish cover, invertebrate habitat, and canopy cover. So once again, it's a rapid assessment. It gives you it's a very coarse-grained approach, but it gives you an idea of major impacts to the river. All right, so that was our stream assessments. We also conducted water quality testing. We identified 7 locations. So if you look here on the graph or the figure, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We try to locate these points immediately downstream of any major tributary so we can pick up any sort of new sources of inputs coming into the river. We analyzed samples were collected biweekly primarily throughout the summer. We measured samples for oxygen levels, pH, conductivity, nitrate and phosphate, which are nutrients, chlorophyll A, which is an estimate of algal biomass, and bacteria levels. So what we found overall, and once again, students led all of this work. They collected the samples, they did the lab analyses. Only 2 parameters exceeded guidance values. So these are the ones in red here. So phosphorus at all of the sites, these are averaged over the course of the entire summer. The top number is the average. The bottom number in parentheses is the standard deviation. So how much variation there is around that average. And you can see phosphorus levels and bacteria levels exceeded guidance values at every site. Looking at those same values, this is a graph showing phosphorus over time. Each dot represents a different site. You can see for the most part, red dots exceed the guidance values of 0.05 milligrams per liter. These aren't regulatory standards, they're guidance values. Most of those dots are red, right? So generally speaking, throughout the course of the entire summer, it was fairly elevated. So from June through October, we had elevated phosphorus levels. It's an important nutrient for algae growth or eutrophication, so that is a concern. This is a graph looking at Enterococcus data, so bacteria. And once again, you can see most of the dots here are red. There is a general trend towards increasing in August or so. So for Enterococcus, EPA recommends public notification or possible beach closure once counts exceed 60 counts per 100 milliliters. So you can see some of these are in the thousands. So we really had very high levels of Enterococcus for most of the summer throughout the entire Pocantico. Remember, each one of these dots represents a different site. So to highlight some of the major findings of the study, that was just kind of, once again, that wasn't everything. I'm going to share the hard copy report of the characterization with Emily, so you guys can access that if you want. But some of the kind of high level or higher order findings, I'm trying to move my Zoom thing because it keeps distracting me. Um, Primarily, the water quality was one of the big ones, specifically the bacteria levels, which didn't surprise us because Riverkeeper's data show the same thing, and nutrients. So we're currently conducting additional work with students to try to pinpoint sources of that, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. I didn't talk about our fish surveys, but the fish surveys overall show that there's a lack of minnows in the upstream sections of the river. Not sure what's driving that, but that's something else that could be looked into. Stakeholder engagement. We were, as I said, disappointed in that we weren't able to engage private individuals and businesses. I personally think we need to do a better job of that because if we want to get broad community support for conservation in this watershed, we need all stakeholders to come to the table. I know that's easier said than done, but it's important. Riparian protection and restoration is another recommendation that we're looking into to move forward. So this graph here on the right, you can see kind of the green and yellow areas. These are riparian areas as defined or identified by the New York Natural Heritage Program. Yellow areas are riparian areas in developed zones. Green are riparian areas that are in undeveloped areas. And I know it's hard to see, but you can see the little dots maybe along the river. Those are where we conducted the assessments. And these dots are just representing in this figure are the scores of those sites for the riparian condition or the riparian zone. So if you have a red dot, it means that the riparian zone scored poorly. So what we're doing now is starting to look more closely at where do we get these red dots in the riparian zone, specifically in yellow areas or undeveloped areas, as a way to maybe identify priority areas for buffer restoration. Open space conservation and stewardship is another area that we think we need to follow up on. As I said, most of the watershed is developed, or about half of it's developed, and most of the open space is currently protected, but there are a couple large properties that are not. And we think, trying to engage those landowners to ensure that or to facilitate the stewardship of those areas would be beneficial to maintaining the health of the watershed. I'm just checking my time. Okay. And finally, our municipal ordinance and policy review, we think needs to be revisited. As I said, we just did a quick yes or no in terms of the various policies on the books in the different communities. But we need to do a deeper dive to look at the actual nuts and bolts of those policies to see, are they currently up to best practices? Can we make suggestions for improvement to those municipalities? So lots of ideas for future and for future work. So our next question was we did all this work, we have all this information, how do we share it? So typically you write up a watershed characterization report. And these are these long reports. Ours is about 60 pages, which I think might be on the shorter side. I am a very brevity is my strong suit in writing, I guess, maybe. And so the estuary staff, I apologize, they had to drag me along kicking and screaming to continue to add to the report to really flesh it out. But I think it needed a much better report in the end. But it's still fairly long, 60 pages, and then we probably have maybe a couple hundred pages of appendices as well. So not many people, especially the general public, aren't going to be reading that. It's going to probably go up on a shelf somewhere, right? So one idea that we explored was using a story map as a way to present this information to try to make it accessible to a broader audience. So this is, once again, this was a very public-facing tool that we were using. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can share the story map with you all. I'm going to give it a second. I don't know, Emily, if you can hear me, can you see it? All right, thanks. So this is our story map. And once again, this was led by a student. Once again, we did not want to present every aspect of the characterization because I think we felt it would just be overwhelming to people. But we have these 9, I think it's 9, I can't see the bars in the way, these eight tiles that we decided to focus on, tiles that we thought might be most interesting to the general public. And you can click on each one, and I don't know why it's not. Okay. And we added text. We tried to make it easy to read, but there is quite a bit of text. And you can integrate maps and figures. So this is just a simple like slider map that shows the watershed itself, and then you can see where the different municipalities occur within the watershed. Um, Information's about groups in the watershed. This is oops, I'm going to scroll back up. So we have another page for habitats and land use. So you can embed maps within your story map. Is it going to work? Yes. So sometimes they take a little while to load. But this was the habitat map that we created. So you can zoom in to look in your backyard or wherever you want in the community, and we have our different polygons representing the different habitats. If you click on them, it tells you what it is. So this one is an emergent marsh. Gives you some idea of the size, but you can zoom around and look for different habitats in the watershed. And then down below, we just had basic descriptions of different habitat types. We try to incorporate pictures to make it a little more engaging, but it is a lot. It is a lot of information. Let's see what else. So I'm not going to show you everything, but maybe we'll highlight just a few more. Um, we did a water quality page because we thought people might be interested in this, where we talk about things like sources of pollution, standards, with some information on water quality standards here, DEC classifications. We have a table trying to pull all this information together in one place. So one of the challenges with these maps, just like anything else that you put online, is keeping it up to date. So we did have a portal here to the Division of Water, their monitoring data, and you can see it's moved, and we haven't updated it in a little while. We have Riverkeeper. We have a link to their data. Whoops. Some of the PACE data that I showed you is presented here, and we also have a map showing our water quality sampling points. And if you click on a point, it gives you the averages of values for that point. What else? So we included other things, recreational use. We have maps of parks, locating parks and preserves in the watershed, trying to get people out to the different areas. We have a partnerships page where we're highlighting some of the various community partners in the watershed, Rockefeller, Stone Barns, Riverkeeper, information about each organization. Once again, just trying to kind of engage the broader community. So that is the story map. I think, once again, this was a student-led project, and I think it came out pretty well. Obviously, it could be done. I've seen some really kind of really nice kind of higher end ones that are a little more interactive. But I think it's got potential for this type of use in terms of engaging the general public. You do need someone to steward it. That's been a challenge a little bit. But and as I said, to maintain it as well. All right. Emily, how much time do I have left?
Another 10 minutes.
Okay, good. So then I'm okay. Thank you. I can't, where was I? Okay. So yeah, so if you're interested in using story maps, I think, as I said, I think they're a nice tool. But I think that you need a plan, a stewardship plan for them. We've developed other story maps for other users, and they don't have the expertise or knowledge to maintain them, and then they just kind of sit there. And if they're not updated, some of the maps can get glitchy at times, so that's something else. So you need someone to check on them on a regular basis and update them if need be. Okay, so what are our next steps? So that's kind of a summary of what we did and how we presented it. What's next? As I mentioned earlier, the project identified a number of areas of concern or future directions. So who's going to do all this work? So that's the challenge. That's always the challenge, right? The future, specifically of the Pocantico River Watershed Alliance, really isn't clear. So one of the questions that we asked stakeholders was, who do you see as leaders in the watershed, environmental leaders in the watershed? And you can see there is a lot of different leaders that have been identified, right? There's no kind of one clear dominant group. And I think this is a good thing. So you're getting lots of different voices. Um, but I think that one of the reasons that we've struggled is we don't have this one kind of overarching um, entity or structure that kind of guides all of these, brings all these groups together so that we're working together towards addressing some of these issues. Um, at pace right now, we're struggling a bit with defining what our role is. Do we want to just be a source of information, which is kind of historically what we've been, or do we want to take more of a leadership role and direct this work? Um, I'll be honest, bandwidth is an issue to do this. And so I don't have an answer. It's something we're struggling with. I was just talking to Emily about this earlier. And I think we need to continue to kind of talk to partners and see if we can come up with some sort of plan for addressing this. Sorry, yeah, turn something off. Okay, so I just wanted to take a couple minutes really quickly to talk about engaging students in this work, because as I said, this was a student-led project. Students collected most of the data. Um, we're continuing to work with students on this. So recently we had a student in a GIS course do some additional mapping in the watershed. So remember, I said that we identified high levels of bacteria throughout the entire river. So what this student did was identify where major tributaries are coming into the river and then map out sub-watersheds for those tributaries. So that was part of a GIS project in a course that that student did. And then we had another student go out as part of an independent research project and conduct water sampling at these points. So it wasn't in the main stem of the Pocantico, it was in their main tributaries. And what we found was one of these does not look like the other. This point right here, which was the watershed for the village of Briarcliff, which is over here, your right, had significantly higher levels of E. coli. I presented Enterococcus data before. This is E. coli now. So one of these watersheds is a major source of E. coli contamination. And what we're trying to do now is kind of, okay, well, what is it about this one specific area? That's our next step. We had another student who did a culvert study in the Pocantico looking at how wildlife potentially could use culverts to cross under roads. So he put out cameras at culverts and looked at, once again, animal usage. You can see he found quite a bit. Some were fairly surprising to me. Here we have a bobcat going under the culvert. We have a coyote over here. He measured culverts. He collected a variety of data to try to see which culverts were most used by wildlife. And the most important factor that we found in terms of wildlife usage is that there's some amount of exposed sediment within the culvert. So you can see here where the bobcat's walking or where the coyote is walking. If there's some sort of way that they can travel outside of the water, wildlife are more likely to use it. So beyond the Pocantico, I've worked with students on a variety of these kind of community science projects. There's lots of different ways that groups can engage students to help with this work. There's internships, which can be paid or unpaid, independent research, which students can take for credit, course projects. I've done a number of course projects. I have a habitat assessment course, and as part of that course for the final exam, we do habitat mapping, and we work with local parks and preserves. If they want a habitat map, we integrate that into the course. And some students are required to do some sort of volunteering as well. I've had students participate. Well, let me step back for a second. The projects that tend to be the most successful have well-defined goals, reasonable expectations. Keep in mind, these are students, these aren't professionals. But if you just need some data collected to support something, I think it can work out really well. Over here, we had students assist the town of Ridgefield, Connecticut, conduct a natural resource inventory. They didn't do the whole NRI. That was way beyond the scope of what they can do, but the town said, we need someone to do vernal pool surveys and some wildlife surveys. So we integrated that into a course, and the students presented it at the town library when they were done, and I thought it worked out really well. So I'm going to wrap up there. For acknowledgments, I'd like to thank the Estuary Program for supporting a large proportion of this work, the variety of partners that have worked in the Pocantico watershed, my fellow PACE collaborators and students. There's too many here to name. I probably missed quite a few, but they were really the driving force behind all of this work. And with that, I will stop and I'm happy to answer any questions on this.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Got some great notes in the chat about how impressive this project is, and a request if you could share the story map link in the chat, if you don't mind. We'll
Okay.
also be sharing that in the follow-up email that you'll all be receiving, but in case anyone wants to explore a little bit while you're live on the Zoom here. So one of the questions is about the scope of a project like this. So how much time, what was the duration of the project? How much time did you spend on this versus the students? If you could sort of speak to the project scope and timeline.
Okay, so the grant was for 3 years. Um, I believe we did get an extension. I think like a 6 month extension. I'm not 100% sure, but we did get an extension to spread that out a little bit longer. In terms of the time spent, it was a fair amount of time on my end. Um, let's see. I was mentoring students. We had multiple students that most of the funding from the ESRI program went towards paying students. Um, so in the summers, we had two full-time students working on this the entire summer. We had a graduate student working year-round part-time on this for most of the project. And in terms of my level, it was a fair amount of work. I can't remember exactly how much, but I was spending, maybe at least 10 hours a week on it. So it was a pretty significant effort. But most of the time I spent was mentoring the students. Um, and that could take up quite a bit of time.
And do you remember the size of the grant? Just thinking about like what's the scope of a project like this would
You mean
cost?
monetary size or what do you mean?
Yeah.
I think it was around 50,000 total. So yeah, it was approximately around that. I think that includes the match. I think that was the total grant.
Okay, great. Yeah, folks are interested in replicating it to know sort of what it takes to pull together this kind of effort. Um,
Yeah.
we've got a question here about collaborating with other colleges and universities. Have you thought about engaging some other colleges and universities to expand the ability to gather data about the watershed?
So yes, we've done a little bit of that. So we worked with Cornell University as part of this watershed characterization. There's a group out of Cornell that does I think scenic vista surveys. Is that right, Emily? Do you know George
Yeah,
and their
George
group?
France.
Yep, George France, and they did. He had a class do kind of these scenic resources surveys. That is an appendix to our watershed characterization. Um, but yeah, I mean, collaborating, I'm always for collaboration. So if there's a way to kind of leverage resources or different areas of expertise, definitely I think it can only be a benefit to the project. So
Yes.
like Pace has two campuses. We have one in Pleasantville and one in New York City. And so some of our city, so it's almost like it's not a different university, but it's almost like a different university. One of our faculty members down there, Ann Toomey, is a social scientist. So she took the lead on helping students with the interviews. So that's definitely not my area of expertise. And so collaboration, like I said, made it a much more kind of robust project.
Yeah, that's great. I think the multidisciplinary expertise of the team really comes through
Yep.
and the amount of information that you've been able to compile and then share. Um,
Yep.
I also have a question here for the interviews. If people were asked if they eat the fish, there's a question about if they were identified as vegetarian or vegan, so as not to skew results. Did you get into like any of the reasons why people might not be interested in eating the fish?
I don't remember to be honest with you. As I said, and Toomey worked with the students on that. I didn't present all of the questions we asked here, but I'm going to make a note of that and I'll double check on that. But I don't know for sure if they did or not.
Okay, great. And then another question here in the chat about the issue of private companies or private landholders and stakeholders that refuse to participate in the interviews and the assessment. Does your team know of any examples or projects or planning efforts in the region where that stakeholder group has been positively engaged or at least willing to collaborate in some way?
I do not know of any that have had success. It's interesting because there's one group, I'm not going to name names, but there was one organization that we reached out to that they were excited when we initially reached out to them. They're like, absolutely, we'll talk to you. And then we got a call before the interview a couple days later saying that they no longer were able to do it. So I don't know if they kind of ran it up the flagpole and were told no or what. But yeah, I don't know of any groups that have in our region that have had traction with these stakeholders.
So if you know any folks on the webinar, write it into the chat if you've got any good examples of this to share across the region.
Yeah.
Um, okay, great. And another question about access to this information beyond the story maps. Did you do any press releases or QR codes around town or local events? Um, and so how did that all get out into the public? And then would you consider incorporating political science students or environmental studies students to get into more detail on the policy side of things?
Okay. So a couple questions there. Great questions. So the first one, how do we get the word out? So that's an area where we haven't done as probably as much as we should at the moment. We had envisioned using the PRWA to help us get the Watershed Alliance group to help us get the word out. But because of the fact that they're not currently active, we haven't really made progress there. So I think much needs to be done there to kind of to get the word out about some of this information. And that's something, as I said, we're still honestly, like I said, we're still trying to sort all that out to figure out the best way to move forward to get some of this information out. What was the second part of the question again?
Political science students or environmental studies students to take a deeper dive into the policy side of things.
Yeah, so we absolutely. We would love to engage those groups. We do have, so our department is environmental studies and environmental science. So I would say I know that most of the students that were involved in this were science students, but a few were policy students, specifically the students involved with the interviews. And one student used the interviews as her capstone project. So yeah, definitely bringing in those perspectives is, I agree, is 100% important because a lot of this is dealing with kind of human nature and individual kind of opinions and in understanding how to access those or to bring in all these different groups is really important. As a scientist, I'm not necessarily trained for that, but that's why we bring in these other people. Mike Finewood, who is also involved, is a social scientist. So we're trying to kind of bring in these different voices.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's a really great example too of some of the engagement work that can happen up front at as part of this process, getting out on those trailheads, being in view of the Pocantico River, having conversations with folks that might have an interest but might not be a part of a, official group or official
Yeah.
stakeholder entity. So I think it's an innovative aspect of this project that we can learn from as well. So we're going to wrap up with just the 1 minute, and I'll just say too, to echo what you said, Mike, that the watershed groups are so critical to taking next steps from these kinds of characterization and planning efforts. And watershed group capacity building is so important to make sure the group is able to take those messages and share them with the community and really play that role in next steps. So, we've been partnering on capacity building work for the Pocantico River Watershed Alliance, along with some of the planning support, and all of these aspects are really interwoven. So thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks so much, Mike, again for presenting this great project. And we'll be sending a follow-up email with the recording, the story map link, the presentation PDF as well, so you have access to take a closer look at everything. And we look forward to staying in touch and seeing everyone soon at another upcoming event.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Have a great day.